Welcome to Inside Events, a new contemporary podcast focused on contemporary issues in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Judith Mair from the University of Queensland, who's going to talk a little bit about the socio-cultural impacts of events. Welcome, Judith. If you could just introduce yourself, your organisation, and why are you particularly interested in the socio-cultural impacts of events?
Thanks, Mike. So I'm Judith Mair from the University of Queensland. I'm an associate professor in the tourism discipline of the UQ Business School. And I've been in Australia for 17 years now, but originally come from Scotland in the United Kingdom. My interest in socio-cultural impact started a long time ago. When I first graduated from university, I lived in Edinburgh and I worked in the Tourist Information Centre there. And Edinburgh, particularly during the festivals, is hectic. Lots of tourists, lots of buzz, very exciting, but actually quite a difficult place to live. Very difficult to go about your daily life. And so I kind of squirreled that experience away. And as I moved through my career in the tourism industry and then events and then moved into academia, I never really lost that interest in what tourism and events does to the people that live in the place that hosts them. And I guess it's just always been something that I find fascinating. I'm always interested in people, but for me, it's not so much the tourists, although I guess that's important, or the event attendees, but actually what's happening to the poor people who are trying to live their daily lives in a place where an event is probably disrupting them a fair amount.
And Edinburgh is exceptionally disruptive, as are a lot of places all around the world, especially because we've seen, more and more events and festivals have gone out of private venues and now they permeate increasingly into public spaces, urban squares, parks, etc. So they're having a much more impact on everyone's lives, haven't they? In terms of the kind of concept of socio-cultural impact, so that used to always confuse me as a student. Like socio-cultural, the minute I put a hyphen in between, suddenly I don't get what it means. I know social impacts, I know cultural impacts, but for those might be in their kind of first year, for example, just kind of getting to grips with this sort of term, what do we mean by socio-cultural impact?
That's a really good question. And actually, it's not necessarily one I've got a great answer to, I have to say. If we think of the triple bottom line of sustainability, which is traditionally economic, social, and environmental impacts, we act a little bit as though these are separate things. But of course, they're not separate because economic impacts have social impacts and social impacts can affect the environment, as can economic impacts. So these are kind of intertwined. So I guess economic impacts can have a social dimension, and that to me is what we think of as socio-economic impacts. That's things like your jobs, job security, livelihoods, things like that. What I'm more interested about, I guess, is that that social space, which is not necessarily to do with money coming in. I mean, that's important, I get that, but I'm more interested in what it means for communities, for societies, for people's history, heritage and culture. So I guess when we put that hyphen in there and call it socio-cultural, it's a way of differentiating it from socio-economic. If that helps, I'm not sure.
No, that's really, really, really useful. And if we think about why people should care about this particular topic, it's obvious why we should care on a kind of on a general level, but what are the kind of key points that you'd want to hit home to people listening to this?
Well, I guess one of the reasons we should care is because we're almost always one or other party to socioeconomic and sociocultural impacts. So we are either the event attendee going somewhere to attend an event, and therefore our behaviour is impacting those people that live there, or we are in fact the residents and we live somewhere where there are a lot of events. So like my case when I was in Edinburgh, I was the resident, but I was being significantly impacted in my daily life by what was happening around me because of the events. And if you think about, I guess it stretches from the whole gamut of different types of events. If you live in a really small village in a rural community, an event might be the key thing that happens in your year that gets people together. And that's really important to build that sense of community and to give people an opportunity to come together. And it might be a small thing like a street parade or, just a very, very small little fair or festival, but it's the key thing that brings people together. Alternatively, if you live in a big city and you're about to host the Olympic Games, hello Paris, or Los Angeles, or even Brisbane, where I live now, that is going to really significantly impact people's lives. And so I think that's why we should care. We're actually impinging on people's culture, on people's way of life, on people's values, just as much as we are bringing them an economic impact by, usually anyway, by the tourism that's generated by events.
That's really useful. Thanks, Judith. And if we think about kind of the concept and where it's come from and where it might go in the future in terms of future trends, could you kind of start by saying kind of a little bit about kind of how the terms developed maybe over the last, let's just say kind of maybe 10 or 20 years, and where will it go? What are the key future trends that people need to be aware of?
So sociocultural sustainability comes from that broader notion of sustainability and sustainable development, which dates way back to the sort of the mid-80s, the Brundtland Report, which was about, was a little bit more focused on the environment in terms of sustainability and not using up resources that were needed for future generations. But I guess as time went on and the United Nations developed its millennial goals, and then after that, the Sustainable Development Goals, that idea of protecting culture and society as much as protecting resources, I guess has become more and more important. When we think of socio-cultural sustainability, there's lots of different expressions, concepts that are used, and they overlap, and sometimes they're a little bit confused or conflated. So we hear about sense of community, sense of belonging, sense of place, social capital, social justice, social inclusion. These are all concepts that are used in terms of trying to understand what the impact is on people who live in destinations that are hosting events. Sometimes social exchange theory is also used as well. And I think that they all have a place, but one of the issues is that they get confused and people say one and mean the other, or, use them as if they're all the same thing. And psychologically, sense of community is not quite exactly the same as sense of belonging, but from a practical standpoint, perhaps that doesn't matter so much. But I think traditionally there has been a difference in approaching the topic depending on what disciplinary background you come from. So anthropologists always interested in festivals, traditional festivals and religious events and things. Sociologists always been interested in festivals as a way of bringing people together and looking at human behavior in the collective. Geographers, particularly human geographers, are much more interested in what festivals represent to different communities. And then, of course, you've got the scholars in the tourism and events area who are more interested in them as a phenomenon in their own right, but less. There has been, I think, less in general on the socio-cultural impacts of events than there has been on the economic impact of events. And I suppose that's understandable because often events are run with an economic purpose. So, it's about bringing bums on seats, if you like, bringing people into a destination or giving people a reason to visit a destination again. Or perhaps it's about extending seasonality in a destination that is, has very high peaks and then has low seasons. So there's always been research in the event space around the economic impacts and the flow on economic side of the impacts to society. But from the tourism and events standpoint, so in the event management literature, for example, there has been much less on these sort of social, cultural, intangible types of impacts. And I think I see that changing. I do see more interest now in particularly that cultural side of things. In Australia, we are seeing a lot more research, for example, in Indigenous participation in events, Indigenous organisation of events, and the impact of being able to showcase culture and country in a way that previously perhaps people didn't feel comfortable doing or weren't able to do. So I do see more research now coming in that space of looking at history, looking at heritage, looking at culture, and seeing how events can help in some instances, and also seeing how events can actually hinder what people want in terms of the way their destination or their culture or their facilities are showcased.
That's really, really comprehensive. Thanks, Judith. And in terms of why people are more increasingly interested in the social and the cultural side, is that because it becomes quite clear in lots of destinations and contexts is that events don't always return on economic investment, and in one sense, and then in the other, the recognition that events are these really powerful platforms for tackling, certain kind of social problems in areas, or advancing social policy and cultural policy. Is it a mixture of those two? Do you agree with that, or is there anything else?
I think you're right. I think there is a mixture of that. We've seen fairly recently with the Victorian government in Australia's decision not to continue with hosting the Commonwealth Games, that the economics of these things are becoming really difficult to manage. We hear about cost blowouts, we hear about white elephant legacies, things that haven't worked out as planned, and so perhaps there is more emphasis on making sure that when we are organising events, should we choose to do them, that we really are focusing on the importance of making sure that if it's a large event, the legacy, or if it's a smaller event, just the impacts on people the negative impacts are minimised and any positives are maximised. But that's not always easy, of course. But I think it's something that people are more aware of, and is probably, I don't know, it's hard to say, but I think it might be in some ways affected by the rise in social media, because up until social media was a big thing, residents didn't have as much of a platform to complain, basically, or to have their voices heard when they weren't happy about something or when they were being affected negatively. And I think social media and big data analysis allows us to get a much more comprehensive view of what people are feeling. And as that view becomes more public, if it's against the event, so if there's anti-event sentiment, then event funders, sponsors, governments, etc., are much more likely to listen. So I think perhaps that might also have something to do with why people are more interested, researchers, but also event funders and event organisers are more interested in what's happening in that host community space.
That's really interesting. And, when it comes to kind of identifying the actual impacts and measuring them, I've had so many conversations over the past years, people in kind of running events in Belgium, in Flanders, or it might be in the UK, or it might be Aussie. There is this always kind of question over how do we actually collect the social impact data, cultural impact data. It's quite difficult. Obviously, it's much more difficult than the economic and the financial aspects and the more quantifiable stuff. Are we getting better at measuring social impacts? Is there a couple of examples that you could kind of give, Judith?
It's hard to say if it's getting better. I think there are some tools out there that can be used. So there are some ways to use proxies and indicators to try and understand some of the more intangible social and cultural impacts that can't be measured directly. But at the moment, there are a variety of different tools that can be used, and that makes comparison very difficult. So, for example, what might be used in one state in Australia is not the same as what's used in another state. And it's almost certainly not the same as what's used in New Zealand or in North America. And so it's not easy to measure anyway, but the tools that are available to do some of that measuring don't really allow for any kind of comparison, which is, I think, another issue that we probably need to look at. I mean, the OECD has recently released some guidelines and a toolkit for trying to measure some of the impacts of major events, and some of that does involve proxies and indicators for the socio-cultural and intangible measures, but they're still not easy things to measure. But it's things like numbers of volunteers, for example, and then we make an inference about how volunteering at an event then has beneficial impacts on your well-being or on your sense of community, etc. So there's still very few direct measures that we can use. But I think if everybody had a better sense of what some of the indirect measures or proxies were, then at least we might be able to do some tracking over time and some comparison across different places.
Yeah, no, that's really useful. Like, I can't help but think that, I think I've said this on a couple of podcasts and other people have said it, that, we're going to look back hopefully in 20 or 30 years and we're going to kind of wonder, why did we invest so much money speculatively in these projects when we weren't fully able to understand the impact of them and how to measure them and use the data to tell the story about why they exist for economies or people or communities and that sort of thing. I suspect we'll look back because my view on it is that this is an absence of data and the way that we can collect data about these social impacts. We all kind of instill this sense of belief and faith that they just have these transcending and these beautiful impacts on the local level, but collecting it is really, really difficult. But when we're in this period of time whereby people are really cancelling and vetoing and questioning events as a sustainable form of development in all the different aspects of sustainability, they need the data to come back to people and say, look, they do this, but at the moment it just seems lacking in just every context that I talk about. Is that do you feel the same sentiment there, Judith?
Yeah, I do. I think you're absolutely right. I think data, and maybe it's because we're academics, but I think data is just key to knowing what's happening, to knowing what people are trying to achieve, whether they achieved it or not. In a state in Australia, which shall remain nameless, measures the social impacts of events by asking a question in the post-event questionnaire about, did this event raise civic pride? Now, I have no idea what that means, actually, when you try to operationalize it. And that question to me doesn't really make much sense. But that is the way that they're measured. And so if they receive a positive response, whatever it is, if 75% of people say that, this event increased civic pride, then they consider that to be measuring the social impact and think that that's really ordinary. But, that I think is just testament to how far behind we are on understanding and measuring the social and cultural impacts compared to some of the other impacts. Although, to be fair, some of the economic impact measurements are a bit questionable as well. But, at least there's a little bit more effort that goes into those.
Yeah, that's true. It's so true. Such a way to go. And to be honest, there's a huge amount of research that's been done on, from academics over the last kind of decades, certainly the last kind of 1 or 2 decades, that people should check out. If people are in industry, listen to this podcast, there's a whole bunch of stuff like you've done, heck of a stuff on this, but there's a whole bunch of and there's stuff in event management, obviously, and International Journal of Event and Festival Management as well. That's got lots of stuff. I'll plug both journals. So yeah, when it comes down to it, we need to do better. And we'll definitely add. We'll have a chat afterwards, Judith. We'll definitely add some resources underneath this podcast if people are looking for further reading and advanced reading on this. But we'll close it out there. But thank you so much for joining us on Inside Events, Judith. It's always a pleasure. You love how kind of clear you describe and explain stuff. It's inspiring. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Judith.